Hello, Dr. Dollar. It's so great to have you here today with us in our virtual newsroom. So before we get started on our conversation, can you introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, what's your specialization and expertise, and what's your current project?
Well, thank you. It's very nice to join you. I'm David Dollar. I'm a senior fellow in the China Center at the Brookings Institution. I've been working on the Chinese economy on and off for several decades. I'm an economist. I had an opportunity to teach in Beijing in 1986, and then for a short period in Chongqing in 1988. So I had that early experience in China. And then I worked for the World Bank for a long time and had a number of different assignments on China, ending up as the World Bank country director, living in Beijing from 2004 to 2009. And then I didn't leave Beijing after that. I stayed and represented the US Treasury for 4 years during the first Obama administration before finally coming back and joining Brookings. And so here I study and write about the Chinese economy and US-China economic relations.
I see. Thank you so much for that introduction. So, as you mentioned, as a leading expert on China's economy, as well as US-China economic relations, you have really sort of witnessed firsthand the trajectory of China's economic performance. So, this week we are sort of in the lead up to China's most important annual political meetings later this week, the 2 sessions. From your standpoint, what are the key domestic economic challenges China faces to the Xi Jinping leadership? And is the current leadership equipped to overcome those challenges?
I think China faces 4 main domestic challenges, and they naturally fall into 2 groups of 2. So first would be aging of the population plus rural-urban divide. In the case of population, China's fertility rate has dropped well below replacement. The population is going to start to decline. That'll be very gradual. But the first thing that happens in this kind of demographic shift is the number of old people is going to increase quite dramatically. Between now and 2049, the number of old people over 65 will more than double, and the number of people over 85 will more than triple. So China is going to have to spend more resources on healthcare and assisted living and helping this aging population. And then I say that's closely related to the rural-urban divide because China still has a household registration system that makes it difficult for whole families to move around. And most of the elderly are living in the countryside, and I think some of them will probably be happy to do that. But there are others among the elderly who will want to move to the city to be with their grown-up children who are working in the cities. And so I think more mobility will help deal with the aging problem. And then one issue for the aging problem for the economy is that the workforce is going to start to decline. So you want to use labor as efficiently as possible. And there's still quite a few people in the countryside who are working unproductively, who could move to the cities and become part of the urban workforce. So I think reforming or breaking down the hukou system, reforming education and health to, in some sense, unify the rural and urban systems, this is probably the single biggest challenge China faces. The other 2 issues, and again, they're each closely related, are reforming the financial system and making China a more innovative economy. The financial system has had a lot of reform, but it's still a bank-dominated system where state-owned banks mostly take deposits and then lend money to state-owned enterprises and local government. And we've seen a big run-up in debt in China, debt relative to the size of the economy, and that's a signal that the financial system is not operating efficiently. And I think part of it is this focus on financing state enterprises and working through these state-owned banks. And I relate that to the whole issue of innovation. Chinese leaders are talking about the need to increase innovation, and they were absolutely right. That's the key to moving to high income. But I think some of their policies are misguided in the sense that they're channeling resources to state enterprises to build up global champions. And that's not really how innovation takes place. Even in China, it mostly comes out of the private sector. Most of the patents in China are allocated to private firms and private individuals. And so what most economists recommend is creating what we call a good ecosystem for innovation. And China has a lot of the ingredients. It's got millions of students coming out of college in the science and engineering fields. They just announced a record amount of spending in 2020 on research and development. So China spent 2.4% of GDP on R&D. You've got a vibrant private sector and lots of good entrepreneurs, gradually improving intellectual property rights. But I think, moving away from that state-directed industrial policy aimed at state enterprises and focusing on that ecosystem, which also includes the financial sector. That's why I put these two issues together. If the last thing I'll say on this is, in some ways, the old style financial system, is the bank lends money to a manufacturing firm and uses the equipment and the building as collateral. And that's pretty simple, right? But now China, as you move into the innovation economy, it's not so much factories as intellectual property that's important. So companies are starting up based on inventions, patents, brands, and a good financial system will lend money against that intellectual property. But that's a much more complicated business than just checking whether there's really machinery in the factory and that kind of old style financial system. So, I think those are the main challenges that China's economy faces. I'm pretty confident the government is going to deal with the aging and the rural-urban divide. Mm-hmm. Jiangxi province just completely eliminated, hukou registration, any kind of restrictions. I think we'll see more trend toward that. And I think the government is ready to put more resources in taking care of the elderly. So those issues, which in some sense are more social, I think probably you'll get pretty high marks from the government. And then on the other challenges, I agree with your sentiment that the instinct of the top leadership seems to be to stick with state enterprises and targeted industrial policy. But China's a complicated place. You definitely see pushback against that. I find it very encouraging that China recently signed the RCEP agreement with Asian partners and the European investment agreement with European partners. These are bold moves to open up the economy more. They will constrain the leadership in following a targeted industrial policy because they're opening up to a more competitive global market. So I see a kind of struggle going on in China. And often in that situation, you'll get an intermediate result where they're certainly not going to give up on some of the state-directed industrial policy. But if they have large parts of the economy that are open and competitive, that I think is quite positive for China's future. And I think you'll get better results from the open competitive parts of the economy. And then policymakers over time, they tend to notice what works and what doesn't work. And good policymakers double down on the things that work.
I see. As you mentioned, this idea of sort of market-oriented reform or structural reform is something that seems pretty crucial right now. And actually, that has been the focus of the Trump administration in the past 4 years, despite the relations between the two countries have been really tumultuous during the past 4 years. So I wanted to chat a little bit about U.S. and China economic relations. Looking ahead for the next 4 years, we have a new administration who seems to be more focused on alliance, on cooperation. So can you please tell us a little more about the people in the Biden cabinet who will be in charge of the administration's China policy? Who are those people? What do we know about those people? And how are they likely to be different from their counterparts in the Trump administration?
I think it's hard to say which individuals will be critical for China policy for the simple reason that China is going to be a big focus of the administration across a large range of issues. And what that means is pretty much every major department will be involved. The Defense Department is doing a review of U.S. policy toward China in the security realm. Obviously, State Department is going to be involved, particularly on climate change issues and human rights issues. Our Department of Commerce executes all of these technology sanctions and investment controls. Actually, not all the investment controls. The Treasury Department chairs the CFIUS committee that reviews inward investment for security. So every major department is involved. And I would say the big difference to expect is that in the Trump administration, there was no coherent China policy because there was very little coordination across these different departments. So State Department could say one thing, but then President Trump would contradict. You had, different departments making different statements about the economy, disagreeing with each other. I think we'll return to a coherent China policy where ultimately it's the president who mediates among these different departments. And in a well-functioning government, it's not going to stand out that person A or person B was the key to the China policy. It's going to be a process of discussion and debate, decision by the president, and then execution by all the different departments. So I think that's the main thing that you can look forward to, is a more coherent policy.
I see. Speaking of coherence or coordination, it's not just a matter of sort of within administration coordination. It's sort of also about sort of coordinating with allies and other countries to tackle the China challenge. I think over the weekend, the Wall Street Journal published an article on how the Biden administration is taking a more pragmatic approach of cobbling together groups of countries to work jointly on technologies, but also sort of separate them into different modules and working on different issues. And the goal seems to be, staying ahead of China in tech, mostly, in semiconductor, in AI, and other advances, that are expected to define the economy and military of the future. So, that sort of remind me of a report you recently wrote with other co-authors, a roadmap for U.S.-Europe cooperation on China. And in that report, you lay out sort of the challenges and the opportunities facing the Biden administration in working with allies on tackling China. Can you briefly introduce us to that report a little bit? What are the main areas of agreement and disagreement between the U.S. and the EU?
Thank you. I think there is quite a bit of potential for the United States and Europe to coordinate on many different issues, including their policy toward China. But we start out in that report pointing out that the Europeans have a very clear approach toward China. They put things in three buckets. So on the one hand, and they lead in most of their commentary, they lead with the positive, that they expect to cooperate with China on global climate change, nuclear non-proliferation in Iran and North Korea, future pandemics, debt issues in the developing world. There's a whole range of global issues, where the Europeans have a positive attitude toward cooperating with China. And then there's a second bucket of issues around economic competition, and including some of the technology issues. And here, the Europeans see themselves competing with China, and their main focus is that if there's a level playing field and fair rules, then competition is generally win-win and both sides benefit. And then third, the way they express it is to say that China presents a systemic challenge to Europe, in that all the members of the European Union are democracies that see themselves meeting a high standard of human rights, and they see China as challenging a global system based on democracies and human rights. So I would say that you could put the U.S. policy in the same three buckets, though I don't see U.S. policy as having been so coherent. But if you put it in the same buckets, I would say the U.S. would lead with the third issue, that the U.S. would lead with China's a systemic rival. They're not a democracy. We don't agree on human rights. And then they would go to the economic and say, well, it's not a level playing field, it's unfair, and it's difficult to get China to change. And then lastly, I would say somewhat grudgingly, they would acknowledge, okay, we probably have to cooperate with China on global climate change and a couple other issues. So in some ways, it's a question of how much weight you put on the different issues. And as I said, I think the Europeans lead with the cooperation. They're the ones who signed this recent investment treaty with China, so they think they can negotiate a fairer playing field. And then they do have concerns about these systemic issues. And so kind of the main point of our report is that there is potential for the US and Europe to work together. But if the US expects that Europe is just going to fall into line and follow the US, that's unrealistic. And in particular, Europe is not interested in containment or a new Cold War with China. And so if the US is willing to be flexible and pragmatic, then there's the opportunity to cooperate with China, both on the economic front, what are the most important issues to negotiate in terms of this level playing field, and then also in terms of values, democracy, and human rights.
Southeast Asia has recently become the center of strategic rivalry, actually, between the U.S. and China. I wanted to start our discussion on Southeast Asia by talking a little bit about this idea of debt trap diplomacy. The idea goes, okay, so China inveigles poor countries to take out loans after loans to build those expensive infrastructures that they can't afford, and that will yield a little benefit. And the end goal of Beijing really is to eventually take control of those assets from the borrowers. But recently, I read a study by scholars from Harvard Business School and Johns Hopkins University seems to offer a different point of view on this idea of debt trap diplomacy. So, what do we know about BRI in general and about this idea of debt trap diplomacy? Is it a valid assessment of what's actually going on in Southeast Asia?
Okay, thank you. Very good question. I'm one of the people who's been quite critical of the phrase debt trap diplomacy. I don't really think it captures much reality. In Southeast Asia, you've got very different types of countries. And in the whole business of development finance, one of the regularities in development finance is most of the money goes to big countries. Kind of makes sense. They're the ones who have big infrastructure needs and a lot of absorptive capacity. So China's lending money to Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan, even India, despite the hostilities. India is borrowing money from China for infrastructure. These are all big economies that have a fair amount of leverage in dealing with China and also have a lot of absorptive capacity in terms of debt. And none of them Pakistan is the only one of those that's in a somewhat difficult financial situation. But most of the countries borrowing from China, large amounts, they're in perfectly good fiscal financial shape, even despite the pandemic and the global recession. Now, having said that, there are definitely some small countries that have gotten into trouble borrowing too much from China. Laos is the best example in Southeast Asia. It's a very small economy, and China has financed some very big projects through Laos, and Laos is having trouble servicing that. So I think the Chinese have quietly rescheduled that debt. But frankly, in most cases, they're not taking over assets because that's not realistic. A lot of what we're talking about are expressways, for example. The Chinese are not going to come in and repossess an expressway. That's really not practical. Some of these projects are power stations. In Pakistan, the Chinese already have an equity position in a lot of the power stations. So they're already part owners. And as Pakistan gets into some debt difficulty, most likely China will reschedule the debts. That means extending the terms, implicitly softening the terms. When you extend the length of the loan, like if you or I go to a bank, the longer we want a loan, usually the higher the interest rate is. So if you extend a loan at the same interest rate for another 10 years, that's actually a kind of, I wouldn't use the word forgiveness, but it's a kind of easing of the terms. So as countries get into trouble, mostly China is easing the terms. And I don't think the Chinese banks are particularly happy about this. I think they went into these projects expecting them to work and to make money. That's another problem with this concept of debt trap diplomacy. It assumes the Chinese are going into this expecting it all to fail, whereas I think the construction companies and the banks involved, they don't expect these projects to fail. They expect these projects to succeed. And there are cases where they fail. The countries have debt problems, but I don't see that that's a deliberate part of the diplomacy of China.
Seems like Xi Jinping has, seen some movements on regional trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries, as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the RCEP, and you also saw some movement on the CPTPP realm a little bit. So that brought me to the question of this trade relationship between U.S. and China. We know during the Trump administration, the focus has been very much on this bilateral phase one trade agreement, so to speak, which is largely failed, by multiple assessment. So the question next is how is the U.S. going to return to a TPP-like arrangement, and how do we actually handle this trade relation between U.S. and China, and also among U.S., China, and also other Southeast Asian countries? So I was a little surprised when I heard the incoming USTR Catherine Tai during her confirmation hearing, sort of indicating more cautiousness as to whether U.S. should work toward a return to CPTPP. She said something like, the basic formula of TPP is still sound, but lots have happened during the past 5 and 6 years. So lots have changed. So how politically difficult will it be for the U.S. to rejoin the TPP? Or a TPP style agreement, and what are the areas will require renegotiations or tweaks to the original TPP agreement, and how should U.S. and China manage their trade relations?
I think it would be very hard for the U.S. politically to come back into TPP. That's certainly true in the first year of the Biden administration. President Biden and his senior staff have been quite clear about that. They're not rushing to get back in. Unfortunately, international trade has become quite a controversial issue in the U.S. It's an issue that divides different elements of the Democratic Party, and we now also have a pretty strong protectionist streak in the Republican Party. And given how polarized our politics are right now, it's hard to see anything passing unless there's very strong Democratic Party unity around it. The Republicans, for the moment, seem to be adopting a strategy of not cooperating with the new administration on anything. And so you're only going to get action where there's Democratic Party unity. And fortunately, there's quite a bit of unity on this need for relief for the economy right now. I think we will get a big infrastructure bill, and we'll probably get immigration reform. We're going to get some very important structural changes in the U.S. economy, but we won't get international trade because that divides the Democratic Party. And the only optimistic spin I could put on this is that I do think that President Biden is going to be going out and consulting with different allies. And in the Pacific, he's definitely going to hear from countries like South Korea, Japan, that they feel the U.S. is missing in action. And he'll hear this in Southeast Asia as well, that China is signing these new trade and investment agreements, which I think is very good because I'm a believer in international free trade and investment. And it's the U.S. that's being left out because of its own politics at the moment. So I think President Biden will hear that. And the way things work in America, if the economy comes roaring back in 2021, which is quite possible, that's going to free up the president to take some risks in 2022. So you might get some action, both U.S.-China direct negotiation. There are a lot of companies in America that are unhappy about the tariffs. And again, the Biden administration is probably not going to do anything about that in the first year. But if the economy is doing well, perhaps in 2022, we negotiate with China to get rid of the tariffs, and China continues to open up and deal with some of the structural issues that the US is concerned with, and the Europeans, because all the details in that European treaty have not been worked out yet. So China is going to be negotiating with Europe on opening up different investment sectors. That is potentially an area where the US and Europe could at least implicitly cooperate. And the same thing with Trans-Pacific Partnership. In that scenario I'm discussing, maybe in 2022, the US approaches TPP. But you did also ask, what would the US be looking for in renegotiation? And that's tough, because probably to make this palatable within the Democratic Party, they would have to be coming up with tough new measures in environmental and labor areas. But it's not clear the existing group of TPP countries would accept that. So, I wouldn't bet money that the US is back in TPP within a few years. I just mentioned it as a possible positive scenario, probably not the most likely case, though.
I see. No, those are all the questions I have for today. Thank you so much for all your insights, Dr. Dollar. It was great talking to you. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you.